Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some Take Flight press plate techniques. Take Flight is the better press of the month for Spellbinders for January 2024. I'm also going to be using the bonus caboodle item, which is the coordinating stencil for the Take Flight press plate technique. Now, these cards are part of the Spellbinders Clubs blog hop that I'm taking part in, and I really couldn't decide which technique I wanted to do when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for creating cards. So I decided to just do both of them. I love using my Betterpress system. I love the fact that it's so versatile and can be used with so many different techniques. So I'm going to create two cards today. They're both going to be 5x7 cards to accommodate these nice large butterflies. To start out with, I'm using both press plates in my Betterpress system. I'm using some Porcelain Betterpress cardstock. I have inked my plates with VersaMark ink, and I also used an embossing powder tool on my cardstock. So when I emboss it with the silver embossing powder, that silver embossing powder is only going to stick to that VersaMark ink. Now, anytime I'm embossing my press plate pressed images, I like to use super fine embossing powder because some of those areas are so fine, and when you use that Betterpress system, it presses right into that cardstock. I want to make sure that that embossing powder will stick to that ink, so I like to use the super fine embossing powder. And then I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder and make sure it goes from the matte granular look when it comes out of the container to the nice shiny glossy silver. Now this set has some dies with it to die cut the press plate butterflies as well as the sentiments. So I'm going to cut them out right away for this particular card. I'm using the dies, and I'm also using some Best Ever Craft tape to tape those dies in place. I want to make sure when I'm doing my die cutting that those die cuts are not going to move in any way. And I always love when there's sentiments that have dies that coordinate with them, because it gives it such a nice finished edge. So I'm die cutting that as well. For the first card, I am going to use that bonus caboodle item, which is that layering stencil. If you don't happen to have that, you could just color them in, or you can just do ink blending over the whole thing to color in the butterfly as a whole. You won't be able to individually color different areas like I can with that stencil set, but you're still going to get a gorgeous look with it. So these are the butterflies before they are colored. I'm going to use that stencil set, like I said, and I'm going to use it with some interference inks. Now, if you haven't seen me use interference inks before, they are ink pads that have two different color tones to them. One looks one color on light or white cardstock, and the other side is the color that will show up on black or dark cardstock. And when I'm using this on white cardstock, I like to play with both of those properties, and I do that by adding some black soot or hickory smoke distress ink. For these butterflies, I'm going to use a little bit of both. So I start with that hickory smoke, I blend it out as far as I want it to go, and then I go in with that black soot and I just go towards the center. By creating a darker area in those butterfly wings, it's going to be able to play off the two properties of those interference inks. So I love the different look that you can get with this. The hickory smoke creates a little bit more of a subtle look, and the black soot creates more of a dramatic look to it. So by using both of these, I'm going to get a really nice transition. But you could eliminate one of these colors and you could just do one or the other. You could use the black soot if you wanted it more dramatic. You could just do the hickory smoke if you wanted it to be a little bit more subtle. For the first interference color I'm using, it's Opal Blush. This pad is very, very juicy. So when you see me take the stencil off of this second butterfly here, you can see that it's kind of seeped into one of the open areas for one of the other wings. You're not going to see this in the end because I'm going to go put some black soot on that area when I go to stencil that part, and that's going to cover up that seepage. So we're not going to see any of that detail there. But the best way to avoid that is by not letting it happen in the first place. So the way to do that is to take off some of the excess ink off of my brush before putting it onto the stencil. Often I'll do that on a solid spot of my ink pad, or sorry, of my stencil, or my glass surface. Either one of those will work. But by doing that, I can get comfortable with how much ink is in my pad, especially if it's a pad that I've just recently re-inked. Often they're a little bit juicier, and that tends to happen when the pads are juicier. You get extra ink and it goes under the stencil. By making sure and ensuring how much ink I have on my brush and I'm getting on my brush, I can make sure to have control over that. Now, one thing that I do between going from the Black Soot Hickory Smoke to the interference pad is I use a microfiber cloth to clean off that area. And that way I'm not getting any of that excess ink that's still sitting on top of my stencil in with my pad. I'm not contaminating my pad in any way. And that cloth is just a dry cloth. It doesn't need to have any dampness to it. That second interference color that I used, by the way, is Lavender Fields. And the third one that I'm going to use for this third layer is Summer Garden. So the Opal blush looks blue on light or white cardstock and pink on dark or black cardstock, or in this case, on top of that black ink. The Lavender Fields looks purple on the white or light and green on the black or dark. So it'll look green when you tilt it in the light and see it on top of that black ink. The third color here is Summer Garden, and that one is going to be green on white or light cardstock and blue on the black or dark or on the black ink that I'm using. So we're going to get some really fun looks here. And even that light color, the color that shows up on the light, when you tilt it into the light, you'll still see a little bit of that shimmer to it. So it really creates a gorgeous look that's perfect for these butterflies. In the clubs for January, there's also a dragonfly die cut, and I think these would be gorgeous for those dragonfly die cuts as well to create the shimmer look for those wings. Now, one of the things I love to do when I'm using layering stencils is choose one of the stencil layers to put some Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel. It's perfect for these butterflies because what it's doing is giving an area some sparkle to it. Now, the Moon Dust is transparent, so I'm still going to see that interference Summer Garden ink that is underneath there. It's just going to add a layer of texture as well as sparkle from the Stickles glitter gel. You do want to make sure to clean that off your stencil as soon as possible. Don't let that stay on your stencil or on your tool. It's easiest to get it off while it's wet. If you happen to let it dry, there's a good chance you're going to ruin your stencil. Now, I am going to pair up my Betterpress of the Month images here with the large die of the month, and this is the Botanical Atrium. So I'm just using some of the foliage and floral die cuts from this set. I have them die cut out of a variety of different Spellbinders cardstock. So these leaves are die cut out of some fern cardstock, and I use that Summer Garden interference to do a little bit of ink blending on there. We're going to see most of the green color, but when you tilt it in the light, you're going to get a little bit of that blue interference. For these flowers, and I think they're poppies, that's what they look like to me, I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending with that Opal blush. This is die cut out of Raindrop cardstock. So by ink blending it with that Opal blush, we're going to see most of that blue ink, but when you tilt it in the light, you're going to get a little bit of that pink interference. And this pad is very, very juicy, so it's going to start going on fairly heavy. I can tap it off on my glass surface to get some of the excess ink off. I also don't want to completely ink blend that cardstock. I still want to see parts of that cardstock. I love seeing the difference between the matte finish of the cardstock and a little bit of that darker ink color as well as that interference. So I'm using some regular ink blending brushes for the areas that I want larger, some detailed ink blending brushes where I want to ink blend just the center of that full flower. And I start with my ink brush in the center of the flower and just work my way out. So as there's less and less ink on that brush, I'm getting less and less ink on that cardstock. Next, I have these tiny purple flowers die cut, and they are die cut out of the Purple Mist cardstock, and I'm doing the ink blending on them with the Lavender Fields ink pad or interference pad. So they're going to have the purple on the inside, and I'm doing that with some detailed ink blending brushes so that I get very little ink there. I'm doing the same technique as I did for that big blue flower, but just putting a tiny little bit of ink on there, focusing the ink on the center of the flower, and then just kind of swirling out. So as there's less and less ink on the flower, I'm getting less and less ink. So you still see the cardstock color on the outside edge. For assembling my flowers together, for these larger flowers especially, I like to add a little bit of dimension to the petals. So I curl them with my fingers, and that way I just get some natural dimension to it. If you want to support that dimension and make sure it doesn't flatten, if you're happen to plan on sending your card in the mail, you can add some dots of glue underneath there, or you can add a pop dot or a foam pop dot to support that cardstock. I typically don't do that. Any card that has some dimension to it, either I hoard it or I hand deliver it so that I don't worry about it getting flattened. With my florals ready to go, I'm going to create my mat for my card. Now, like I said earlier, my card is going to be 5 by 7. These butterflies are really large. You could easily do a single butterfly on a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card. And I do have another video from the beginning of the month where I did use these. I think it was my first video of the month that I used them with. It might have been the second. That I used them with the stencil of the month and just used a single butterfly, and they worked perfectly. For this particular card, I wanted to make sure that I had room for both of them. So that's why the 5 by 7 card. I didn't want to be cramped in a smaller card space. So I have a mat here that I trimmed to 4 3/4 inches by 6 3/4 inches. I used that Opal blush and just did some inking around the outside of that cardstock. It's going to complement the interference colors in both my butterflies and my flowers beautifully, as well as the fact that you're going to be able to see that tiny little bit of interference. It's also much easier than trying to match a cardstock with these gorgeous inks, because that's next to impossible. This is the easiest way to blend it all together, and it always looks fantastic. So for this particular card, I want to have both butterflies on here, and I want them in that position. So I'm going to do my florals starting from the center of the card, going out to the top left and then out to the bottom right. So what I typically do is kind of do a little bit of a rough layout on top of an acrylic block so I can see it right on my background. And then as I'm placing my florals, I will start from the outside and work my way in. And for this particular one, I know that the center is going to have that big blue flower there. So that's where the center of my arrangement is. I want my other blue ones, my half blue ones, on outside of that, but I want them facing different ways. I'm kind of mirroring the different pieces for these layouts. So I'll put it, when I put it on the top part, like this leaf, I'll put it on towards the right of the flower. For the bottom half blue flower, I put it towards the left. So they look very similar, but they're not exactly the same as each other. I already glued down my one butterfly because I want that one to look like it's a little bit more in the background. It's a little bit smaller than the other one, and it's tilted the other way. So I want it to look like one is a little bit farther front than the other one. I'm also using some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. This glue gives you the freedom to wiggle and shimmy things in place while you're making your arrangements. And especially for arrangements like this, it's nice to be able to lift pieces up and tuck things behind it. And by adding that glue behind there, I can make sure that I can add different pieces to it. It also gives me time to work with it while that glue is setting. So once I have all these pieces together, I will often just wait and let everything settle and let that glue dry and solidify before I start doing other things to it. So I didn't glue down my large butterfly yet because I have a few other leaves that I wanted to tuck in behind there. I wanted there to be a base for that butterfly or something behind that butterfly. So I put that back there, and now I'm ready to glue that butterfly on there, making sure that I'm nice and generous with that glue. Because there's so much texture and dimension with these florals behind there, I want to make sure that by being generous with that glue, that there are areas that that glue is hitting, so it's going to glue everything together. Even though there's a ton of texture here already, I always like adding more. So I'm using some silver lining Nouveau drops, and I'm just adding them to the centers of some of the flowers. So for this particular card, I did that for the purple flowers. My Nouveau drops are getting a little bit thick, so I got a couple trails there. So I'm just using my die pick to clean those up before they solidify. Then I'm using some Stardust Stickles with the fine tip, and I'm just adding dots to some of the open flowers. When I'm creating florals like this, I often like to add extras or die cut extras. Here I didn't end up having extras. I estimated perfectly. mainly because I wanted to use them up here and I had the space to do that. Those light colored flowers are die cut out of some alabaster cardstock. I didn't do any ink blending on them because I didn't want to add any more ink colors to the mix. So I just left them as is, and I love them as they are. Now I know that there is a lot to this card. There's a lot of florals. There's a lot with the 2 large butterflies. You could easily simplify it and have less florals, make the card smaller, just use a single butterfly if this is a little bit too much or the card is a little bit too large. Again, I also love adding texture. So here I'm taking that silver lining Nouveau drops, adding dots to the end of the antenna for the butterfly as well as on the body, just giving it some different texture. I think it just enhances the different areas of the press plate images. And the last thing I'm doing here is I'm taking some glossy accents and I'm just adding some dots to the butterfly. This is going to just add some domed dimension, some shiny dimension to it. You're still going to see the ink color that's underneath there, and you're still going to see the shimmer that's underneath there. It just adds some more dimension, and I love the final look of it. When you do the glossy accents, you do want to give it a long time to dry. So I left it to dry for an hour between the glossy accents and the silver lining Nouveau drops and the stickles. I wanted to make sure that I gave everything time to dry. So with that dry, I can set that to the side and start working on the second technique that I wanted to use with the Betterpress of the month. So I'm using my glimmer machine, and I'm also using some alcohol ink Duralar. This is heat resistant clear acetate. So I'm using it with some Aura glimmer foil in my glimmer machine. It foils beautifully. Now, I could have done a little bit slower with my die cutting machine running it through with the hot plates, because there is an area on the larger butterfly that didn't foil quite perfectly, but with the final result, you don't actually really notice that. Now, I'm also using the solid hot foil plate to foil the solid or the remainder of the foil. I don't actually use it in this video. With smaller cards, I will often use those pieces for mats around my card. I can also use it for die cutting different pieces. And I thought about using some of that solid hot foil piece to die cut some of the centers for the florals. In the end, I didn't do it, but that's another way you could tie in that piece and utilize that piece there. Because my glimmer machine was already warm, this is the easiest way to just use it up, put it on some cardstock. The cardstock is much easier to store. With my glimmering done, I'm ready to color in my images. So I have my foiled Duralar here, and I'm going to color it with alcohol ink. Now, I don't want to do the alcohol ink on the side that has the foil, so I flipped it over so the foil side is on the bottom. And I'm going to be doing my ink blending on the back side of this. And I'm doing this before I die cut my images. I want to do my alcohol ink on the back. Often when you're doing alcohol inks, you'll be blowing the alcohol ink all the way to the edge of whatever you're working on, and sometimes that alcohol ink will seep underneath it. By leaving this hole before I die cut it, I can try to avoid getting any of that alcohol ink on top of the glimmer foil that's on the front of it. So you'll see as I'm doing this, I'm using the alcohol ink blower tool to blow my alcohol inks around, to blend them together, and as they go to the edge of the cardstock, I will try to move it around and clean my surface off just to try not to get any of that alcohol ink on my foil. I end up getting just a tiny little bit on the butterfly that I do end up using for this particular project, but it's really hard to see on the final result. If you wanted, you could use a little bit of isopropyl alcohol to clean it off. I didn't find it was totally necessary, but what I am trying to do as I'm working around this is I am trying to make sure to get some of that excess alcohol ink off, and also to make sure that I'm keeping my butterflies as clean as possible. The colors of alcohol ink that I'm using here are some of the newer colors that were released. One of them is a color that was discontinued and brought back. So they are Cosmopolitan, Bayou, and Juniper. You could use any alcohol inks for this. I just liked those 3 colors together and chose 3 that were in the same kit together to try to make it a little bit easier. And then I chose florals that went with that as well. So here is the final result. I am going to leave it alone to let that completely dry before I do my die cutting. Now the Duralar does die cut. However, really intricate pieces, like where that antenna are for the butterfly, it has a little bit of a harder time with that. So I will be bringing in my detailed scissors just to help with that as I'm taking it out. For that large butterfly, I end up not using that particular one. I'll save it for a future project. I end up using the smaller one because I like the way that it's facing for the card design that I want to create. Now, I also foiled my sentiment for this, so my sentiment is on there, and I will die cut that as well, and it die cuts beautifully just like it does at a cardstock. I just thought it would be an interesting look to have that alcohol ink behind the sentiment and have that foiled sentiment on the Duralar. It ties in well with those butterflies. So you see, as I'm pulling my die cut out, the wings themselves, everything else die cuts beautifully, but it has a little bit of trouble with those antennae. Now, what you can do to help it is put a little piece of printer paper or cardstock underneath this when you're die cutting. Often that will help it do its die cutting. I forgot while I was doing this, but you can see without that, it does a good job of most of it. So just be aware that if you're using Duralar, easy shapes that don't have a lot of detail will die cut beautifully. More intricate areas, you might have to help it along. And it will put an imprint of that die cut so you can see exactly what needs to be die cut. And you can see that that sentiment die cut beautifully without any help. The butterfly, the second butterfly here, it mostly went in. There was just one area where it was catching that I needed to help it along there. So this is a great way to create some interesting embellishments with your press plates and with alcohol ink and Duralar. It works beautifully. So for this card, I'm once again using die cuts from the Large Die of the Month Botanical Aquarium to go with my Betterpress butterflies. And again, you don't necessarily need to. You could have the butterflies all on their own with a sentiment. I just really love the way that those butterflies look with the flowers and foliage. So I've already ink blended my leaves. Those were die cut out of sage cardstock and ink blended with some bundled sage distress ink. And I did that with a large Spellbinders ink blending brush. It works perfect for larger areas. These purple flowers were done out of purple mist, and I'm using some wilted violet distress ink to do that ink blending with a detailed ink blending brush. My smaller flowers here are die cut out of pink sand cardstock, and I'm using some Kitsch Flamingo distress ink to do that ink blending. And the ink blending that I do on these ones are the same as I did for the first card. The only difference is these are distress inks and those were interference inks. But once again, I'm keeping some area where it is not ink blended because I want to see the difference between the inked part as well as the cardstock part. It gives it a little bit more visual dimension. Or visual dimension. So for these small flowers here, these are die cut out of alabaster cardstock, and I'm using some scattered straw distress ink to ink blend those. And anytime I'm doing ink blending from the center, I do it in the same way. I start with that the center of the flower when I have the most ink on it, and then as I'm getting less and less ink on my brush, I will move around. Now, I was creating this and in time when I had to go out, so I had some air time for things to dry. So for this particular card, I'm putting my my stickles and some pale gold Nouveau drops on the centers of the florals and letting them dry before assembling my card. Depends what your personal preference is. Sometimes I'll do it when I'm assembling my die cuts. Sometimes I'll do it after my card is done. It just really depends on the way my day is working and how I'm using my time and whether I have a bunch of time where it's just going to sit there. Things might as well dry when they're sitting there. For the background of this card, I'm using the embossing folder of the month. This one's called Faceted Petals. And I think I forgot to say what the last one was. That one was the 3D embossing folder of the month, which is Stylized Lattice. I wanted to do different backgrounds and different embossing for each one just to show the different look. I did a little bit of ink blending with that bundled sage distress ink on my background based on where my florals were going to go. Now, because I'm doing a 5x7 card here, I have a piece of Inca Gold cardstock. This coordinates beautifully with that Aura foil. It's a gold mirror cardstock that has a iridescent shine to it. And I'm using that for my mat. So that is cut to 4 3/4 inches by 6 3/4 inches. My piece that is embossed here is cut down to 4.5 by 6.5. So it creates a really nice outline there. I would have used solid hot foil for that, except I don't have a plate that's large enough to create one for 5x7 cards. For this card, I'm doing my florals in the bottom left corner. I wanted to do 2 different arrangements for both cards just to give you a different look that you can get and give you a couple different layouts that you can use. And again, I'm starting in exactly the same way as I did for my first card. I will use that acrylic block, put it on top of my background, and then put a few of the die cuts just to give myself an idea if the layout that I have in my head is going to work and look the way that I want it to. Once that's done, again, I work from the outside in. So I start with the pieces that are most out, or the outermost pieces that are towards the background, and I will layer my way towards the middle. When I get close to the middle, I will put my center floral in there and then some florals around that. And sometimes the florals around that will be tucked underneath that center floral. Sometimes it'll be leaves that are tucked underneath that center floral. Now, I did the same dimension on these florals that I did on my first one. So I curved the petals as I was assembling them. For some of the smaller leaves, I'm gluing them down flat. For some of these larger leaves, I'm curling them with my fingers as well, making sure to leave an area that is nice and flat that I can put glue on that will have good contact with my background. And as I get to gluing some of the leaves behind that center floral, some of the stems on them are a little bit too long. So I just take my fingers and I tear those stems off. You could also use some detailed cutting scissors and snip them. It's easy enough to just tear them off. So even if you die cut a full die cut, doesn't mean you need to keep the entire thing, especially when you're creating something like this, where it's going to be tucked underneath something. It doesn't matter whether it's the entire die cut or if you tear off a piece. And often when I want a smaller stem, I will do that as I'm arranging. Most of the time when I have these designs in my head, I have a general idea of how I want it to look. I don't know exactly where every single floral is going to be placed, so I don't necessarily know which ones I want longer stems on and which ones I want shorter stems on. So by doing it as I'm working, I can tear stems off on areas or on florals that I want them to be a little bit shorter. When it comes to gluing down my butterfly, because it's transparent, I'm putting dots of glue behind that foiling. I want to make sure that my glue is not visible. So when it comes to my sentiment here, because that sentiment is so fine, it's impossible to get an area that doesn't have any of that, or has a thick enough area of that foil for that glue not to show. So I put a decent amount of glue there, used my fingers to spread it all around so there's just a clear coat of glue over the entire thing. And then I use my acrylic block to hold down that butterfly as well as that sentiment, just keeping it in place while that glue starts to set. To finish off this card, I use some of the gold mixed gems, and I'm using a die pick to help me put those gems down. I use that die pick to pierce into the adhesive behind those gems, and then I can place them exactly where I want to on the card, use my left hand to press that gem down, and then just slide the die pick out of there. I'm only using a few of the gems. It's just to add a little bit of sparkle to that background. And here is that final result. Now, ultimately, I would have preferred if this butterfly had the coloring that my other butterfly had. I would have preferred if it was more pinks and purples rather than more greens and blues. I like the way that it looks, but if I had the ultimate choice, I would have chosen that coloring, but I preferred the way that this butterfly was positioned for this particular card. And then we have our first card with the interference butterflies. And if you've never seen interference inks or me use interference inks before, there's some of my favorite inks to work with. I have a full playlist here with all the different videos where I'm using them. I love the shimmer that they give these gorgeous butterflies. These butterflies are perfect for these cards, but they'd be fantastic on scrapbook layouts as well. And at some point, I will likely use them for that as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.